know about America and democracy. There is no America. There is no democracy. We no longer live in a world of nations and ideologies. The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business. And I have chosen you to preach this evangel.
For all my free market healthcare robbing, stock stealing, retirement fund fucking with niggas. Fuck you little credit card scamming, jewelry stealing, crack selling, liquor store robbing motherfuckers. Shout to the homies, Carnegie, OG, Willie Randolph Hearst, Baruch, Rockefeller, the real Rockefeller, my main bitch Leona, pour out a little Louis XIII, Scott Rothstein, Jack Abramoff, hold your head, my real shop niggas, let's get this money. I spend my day peppering America overseas, pension for the workers, nigga please, embezzlement, etiquette, private settlement, I'm better with Confederate rhetoric from my mansion in Connecticut, foreclose of it, close out the tenement, I twist words like a speech impediment, I hope you got good credit, bitch, if not, better get a new job with benefits, while I play golf with niggas to get cheddar with, new money buys brand new carrots, my old money bunch of great grandparents, you got grills in your mouth, I ain't mad at ya, I own every gold mine in South Africa, thanks baby, you made me $1 billion, plus I own a building, for each one of my children.
Welcome to this edition of Voice of Rebellion Radio. This is your host, Chris J. here. It is right now, currently, if you're listening to this live on Staybold Radio, it is noon Eastern Time, 9 o'clock over on the West Coast. I have my lovely and very respectable guest, Roslyn all the way from Ireland, is coming on this show. So this is actually the second straight week that we've had a guest coming from Ireland. Last week we had Sergei Bardashov from the Humanitarian Battalion Ireland, UK, came on the show from Ireland. And now this week we have Roslyn Fuller. So everyone that's tuned in, whether it is live today on Tuesday or Sunday, prime time, 9 o'clock Eastern Time at the one and only UCY TV, or on YouTube later, as all shows that go on Voice of Rebellion go to YouTube after Sunday night. Wherever you're listening from, thanks for tuning in. One of the main things that have been very pressing in the minds of people all around the world, not just the United States, in Europe, Russia, Iran, Syria, Middle East, really is becoming a worldwide issue, is this war in Syria. In the last few months, we've seen an escalation in the approachment of the United States forces attacking Syrian Arab army and their affiliates, whether it's the Syrian Social National Party and many different other paramilitaries and smaller armed groups that help out the Syrian government. There's been direct attacks now in the last few weeks between the United States forces and pro-Syrian allies. And it really begs the question, is how serious is the United States about fighting the Islamic State when they attack consistently now their enemies, and sometimes directly fighting their enemies? As we've seen in the last few weeks, the Syrian Arab army and their allies were fighting ISIS in the city, and they decided to attack the Syrian army side. Now, no matter how brutal, no matter what you think of Bashar al-Assad, people that listen to my show consistently know that I have my thoughts on Bashar al-Assad, and my opinion is going to differ from a lot of people's. But no matter what you think of Bashar al-Assad, what you think of who the man was before the Civil War, the reason why you think the Civil War started, unless you are watching most heavily biased Salafist propaganda made from Al Jazeera or from, straight from the Syrian rebels themselves, you cannot possibly believe that ISIS is a construct of the Syrian government. You know that the Syrian government is fighting the Islamic State and that they are clearly on two different sides of the war. There is the series that the Free Syrian Army and some people that belong to the opposition tried to put out, kind of dispel their own accusations that have been made by outside forces saying that, and outside groups, that the Free Syrian Army has been pretty much shown to be somewhat sympathetic to Islamic terrorists in the country. But they've tried to say that the Syrian government constructed ISIS in order to put down the Syrian revolution, pointing out the prisoners being released from Syrian prisons by the government. But in reality, the evidence does not really show this to be the case, and they have two very different visions for Syria. Is that ISIS is a Islamic, if you can even call it that, it's a twisted version of Islam that's rooted back to Wahhabism, and they believe in a total Sharia law, a total domination of the Sunni, I guess you could say, or Wahhabist ideology over the country, and anybody else, Shias, Alawites, any other sect of Islam or different religions would be put down in this future state, while Assad and his father always supported a secular regime that did not discriminate on religion. And, you know, people talk about that there's a sectarian difference in this country, that the Sunnis are put down while the Shias get a privilege. But the Shia population, as a minority in Syria, do not constitute the majority of his army. 90% of Bashar al-Assad's army is Sunni. So mainly Sunnis fight for Bashar al-Assad. So I think that kind of dispels that misconception about Syria as well, is that Sunnis are repressed in a Shia-dominated country. It's really, truly a secular regime, and Christians are also protected. There is no really religious discrimination. Well, there might be discrimination of other kinds in Syria, as is in pretty much every other country on the planet. Religious discrimination seems to be at very minimal, and very, very minimal compared to some of their neighbors, such as Saudi Arabia, where if you even are, you know, talk about the Bible in public, you're subject to being arrested or even killed in Saudi Arabia, but yet they are getting arms, they're getting money from the United States government. But I'll go to let Roslyn talk here, and not rant for the next 10, 15 minutes. Roslyn, now, what do you think the United States is doing here? I mean, they're talking about how they want to defeat ISIS, and this has been one of the things that Trump is, one of his major talking points is that, oh yeah, I'm going to defeat ISIS in 100 days, or ISIS is not going to exist after my administration. What he's doing effectively is aiding them by attacking their enemies in these different cities. And also, one of the attacks, I believe, happened in Raqqa. I think the Syrian jet getting shot down was in Raqqa, which is literally their capital, ISIS's self-proclaimed capital. And the United States inadvertently, I don't think it was inadvertently, but they'll probably say that, inadvertently helped them out there. So do you think this is all part of an agenda, that they are trying to push these different extremist groups into power? Do you think that this is just blowback from their very convoluted strategy? Or do you think they're just generally telling the truth on this? Which I know you probably don't believe that, but I would like to hear your take on it.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, I mean, there are a lot of unappealing aspects to Trump, but one of his more appealing aspects during the campaign was, of course, his promise to, you know, get tough on terror. And I think some people thought, well, maybe he will actually do something constructive on this point, because when we look at ISIS, of course, you're right, we've seen ISIS grow and grow and grow and grow, and actually be a very, very sophisticated kind of army operation. That being said, of course, compared to the military might of the United States, not to mention all of the other countries involved in this, it's quite minimal and should be fairly easy to deal with. Yet we don't see that happening. I know in the United States, I think the United States media has become much worse just over the last few years. I don't think you read very much actual information in the American media anymore, unfortunately, with a few exceptions. In Ireland, I can say that in Ireland and in Europe in general, these issues like who is funding ISIS, what's at the bottom of this, what's going on here, how can it possibly be the case that a group such as ISIS, which has, as you pointed out, more than extreme religious views and which has taken responsibility for a variety of attacks, how can it be that we haven't dealt with them yet? Those are questions that are definitely being bandied around a lot. Probably the most common theory is that, which is not just, I'd like to put out, like, we're not talking conspiracy theories or something that people are whispering behind closed doors. We're talking, kind of theories that are very openly published in newspapers by very, very respected people in our countries, is that Saudi Arabia is funding ISIS with the blessing of the U.S. That's the general opinion. Like, I would say that's kind of where respectable opinion from people who are politically interested and follow these issues is at over here.
Yes, I mean, the Saudis, it's not even close to conspiracy theories at this point that the Saudi Arabian regime has been funding terror for a long time. They've been the major funder of terror in the Middle East. And it's funny because at one point in the campaign of Donald Trump, about February, March 2016, it seemed that Trump was actually going to take a pretty tough stance against Saudi Arabia. He even, insinuated, and he said that I think he said in one of the speeches, these people might have did 9/11. And in May, I think he got the incident where he called May 2016, he called the Saudi prince, the dopey Prince Alawid. It did not look like he was going to have a pretty good relationship with Saudi Arabia, even though to believe that it wasn't going to happen would be a little bit naive considering that the United States has had a great relationship with Saudi Arabia for a long time now, that the United States would probably never, ever cut off Saudi Arabia. I mean, their relationship with them is second in the Middle East, only, of course, to Israel. And Saudi Arabia, ideologically, clerics that support ISIS and, push out the hateful rhetoric that a lot of the ISIS followers blindly believe. And, of course, I believe that's a combination of both. I believe that some of them are there because they've been brainwashed into the Wahhabist ideology. I think another portion of them are there for the money, to be honest. Because they're pretty much just like a mercenary group with, now at this point, hundreds of thousands of soldiers. And that's the same thing with a lot of the Syrian opposition, not just ISIS, is that they're pretty much as mercenaries that have been imported from other countries into these groups. And that's why this whole talk about even the Syrian revolution is pretty much just falling apart. People don't even really mention, besides like the mainstream media, or, core of the mainstream media will still say Syrian revolution. But at this point, it's obvious this is no longer just a Syrian revolution. This is a multinational proxy war that's going on in Syria between Russia, Iran, the United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia. Everybody seems to have their hands in the pie somewhere.
Yeah, it's like a new Vietnam or Democratic Republic of Congo, like everyone's involved basically in this proxy war that continues to go on precisely because of that, because it's become a very complex proxy war for a whole lot of different interests. But I think to kind of get back to your point, I mean, for years and years and years now, really since September 11th, we've seen the so-called war on terror, which was kind of a manufactured abstract idea immediately after September the 11th. I mean, how do you have a war on terror? No one knows. It's not like having a war in Germany or a war on Chile or something like that. It's an ill-defined objective, but since we've seen that, we've seen it also prosecuted in a way that makes no sense whatsoever. If you wanted to really prevent terrorist attacks and to protect people, you'd go about this in a completely different way. So it's very obvious that political considerations rather than security considerations have taken over this ideology. And I mean, it really surprises me that Americans or the American establishment continues to back this to the extent that they do. If I was living in the U.S., I would definitely be demanding, more logical action to be taken. And I mean, really, to be honest, I mean, ISIS didn't exist. You see, ISIS didn't exist right after September the 11th. We went through a whole lot of different phases where we gradually destabilized all kinds of countries, and more than destabilized them, plunged them into extreme chaos. And that has, at the very least, given these groups the grounds to flourish in, because, we've gone around destroying the stable structures around the world and not put anything in place to replace them. Just kind of said, great, now everything's been destroyed, that's enough, thank you very much. It's a plan that absolutely gives rise to these kind of things.
Yeah.
I mean,
when you
even leaving everything else aside, right? Even leaving aside that the United States was financing the Taliban in Afghanistan in the 1970s, which kind of went on to sort of morph into Al Qaeda, which kind of morphed into ISIS, right? I mean, even leaving all of that aside, going around knocking out governments all around the world, and that's bad enough, but not even trying really to replace them with any kind of stable government, no matter what that government would be. is a recipe for disaster. And I mean, look, people know this, right? I mean, these people who are in charge of administrations in developed Western countries like the United States or like England are well aware of what they're doing. I mean, there's no plausible reason to believe that they don't know what they're doing or that these things happen somehow by accident.
Plus, I think that's what they want us to believe, is that I've heard this term all the time when they refer to the many screw-ups by the United States government in foreign policy. They always say, blowback. It was a mistake. We didn't know this guy that funded would turn into Saddam Hussein. Oh, we didn't know that this guy in the South Vietnam was such a douchebag. Oh, we didn't know that this guy would turn into a fascist dictator and kill 1 million people. You know, it's all kinds of, they use it all the time. And the same thing with the Middle East, I hear. Like, oh, yeah, it's like our war in Iraq, we didn't mean to leave this power vacuum to let ISIS flourish in this country. Oh, we didn't mean to support the Taliban, and then they would become the people that would later do terror attacks all around the world. You know, with that one, that's one of the biggest blunders I can think of. And Brzezinski, who was one of the major people behind the funding of the Mujahideen in the 1970s and 1980s, he recently died. He was literally photographed over there, which pretty sure that was a real photograph, with Osama bin Laden when he was not Osama bin Laden yet. He was just a Afghani freedom fighter, in quotations, at that point, and then later he became the man that we all know as the world-renowned terrorist. The Mujahideen, later became the Taliban when they came to government in 1992 after the pro-Soviet government fell apart after a long war of attrition there. And then in 2000, it's funny, 2000, Mohammed Omar, the leader, I think it was like the Emir is what was the title they had of Afghanistan during the Taliban era, he outlawed opium production, and then all of a sudden there was a problem. The United States was like, oh, this guy is supporting terrorism. When 99% of the opium from Afghanistan was all of a sudden gone, 75% of the world's production all of a sudden cut away. You know that what was really going on behind closed doors is that big pharma and all these, top people that were profiting off the secret opium trade were probably like, oh shit, what do we do now? Like, oh yeah, we'll just say that this guy that we funded a long time ago is now funding terrorists. And then all of a sudden, they're responsible for 9/11, and then there's a war in Afghanistan, and Mohammed Omar and the Taliban's gone. And then the opium's back. Now we have 5,200% more opium being produced in Afghanistan than was in 2000.
I think the issue in the United States is that there's kind of like a national myth, which is that we always intended to do well. To do good, right? And we wanted to go out and we want to go out into the world and we want to help people. And I think that for a lot of, individual Americans, that's true. I think Americans, in general, are really quite nice people and quite nice, caring people. And they do want to help people around the world. And they do actually care about people who are less fortunate than them in a very touching way. But the issue is that the government acts according to a different set of principles, because and most countries do. In an international level, there are international interests. So you work to either protect your country's national interests, which may or may not be in other countries' national interests, or you can work in your own personal interests. So, for example, you could work to enrich the richest people in your country, which is really what the United States does most of the time now. But because there is this disconnect between what the average person thinks you're doing and what the government actually is doing, you have to, make a lot of excuses. So, for example, it was just a mistake excuse, which has been used again and again and again and again. We didn't understand what we were doing. Like you said, who knew this could happen? No one could predict it. This is all untrue. Of course, plenty of people did predict it, in fact. But on top of that, there also has to be a huge amount of, I suppose, I can't really think of another thing to call it at this point than really just kind of like general, quite serious brainwashing where, a message is constantly pumped out in the media that we're always on the side of right. Everything we do is good. The people who we view as allies only do good. The people whom we view as enemies only do evil. It's a very, very black and white picture. It's unrealistic in its black and whiteness. It's actually almost, I feel, sometimes approaching a religious belief itself Because rather than accept that the world is a complicated place where there are different interests, where what's in my interest may not be in your interest necessarily, what's in your interest may not always be in my interest, we might not be able to abstractly determine what is good or right or the truth, as human beings, there's an understanding that, yes, you can do all of that, and in fact, you are doing all of that. And there's this unrealistic assumption or claim to be the purveyors of all that is good and right. And I really think that that's a very dangerous game to play, because I think that at some point, you can only push that so far before it cracks. And then once people start questioning one end of that, where will they stop? It's very hard, I think, to have credibility when you push that narrative so far. It would make more sense to accept that there are different national interests in the world. Like, Russia has national interests, China has national interests, European countries have national interests. Sometimes these national interests are in conflict with each other, sometimes they're not, but instead of kind of rationally discussing that, the United States government insists on this quasi-religious narrative that they sell to people.
The MO, the media, is pretty much make it seem like our government, anyone attached to our government, is 100% good, and they try to make it seem. I think there is a part of that now, especially in modern times. There is a lot of that religious element that's added into the equation. Because think about it, is that, for example, when it comes to Israel, a major player in all this, a major player in the foreign policy of the United States, and I would argue that with their most powerful lobby in America, AIPAC, that they heavily influence our foreign policy. And it's not just me saying this. Is experts, these are top analysts that have said that Israel has seriously altered our foreign policy, not for the better, for the United States, and has got us involved in many wars that we don't belong over there in the Middle East. But think about it, is that when you go to church a lot of times in the United States, is that they'll tell you that, the state of Israel must be protected, and they are the same state of Israel that's described in the Bible. A lot of the people that go to church, are going to believe this wholeheartedly. And you have people like Chuck Hagee or John Hagee or whatever, the guy that runs the Southern Baptist Church, which is one of the biggest churches in America. He literally tells people that if you don't support not Israel in the Bible, the kingdom of Israel, but the current state of Israel, the Zionist state of Israel, that you'll go to hell if you don't support them. So this is how far the brainwashing goes. Now they've taken it one step further. They went from, textbooks to the media, now to the churches themselves, preaching what you could say is Christian Zionism. It's pretty much
that in fairness, that's been going on for more than 20 years. So that's nothing new. But I think the relationship between Israel and the U.S. is somewhat more complicated in that, yes, of course, Israel wants to influence American policy. I think, however, Israel is very, very dependent on the United States. I mean, their geographical position kind of renders that inevitable. So I think there's definitely a two-way relationship there. I mean, to put it bluntly, I suppose one could say they have each other by the balls. Is kind of how I would describe it if I had to put it in one sentence. So I think that's true. I think in other parts of the world, again, I'd say particularly in Ireland, most people actually support the Palestinians because they feel that the Palestinian struggle is very akin to their own independence movement. So if anything, in Ireland, I would say I almost feel that there is like an anti-Israel bias, and in fact, quite a lot of negative feeling towards Israel and Ireland. But, okay, it goes to show that at the end, we are all, I think, being very much influenced by these, I would say narratives, where an official version is kind of pounded home again and again, and again and again and again and again and again and again, to the detriment of, like, hearing anyone else, to the detriment of, trying to resolve the situation at the end of the day, right? I mean, any resolution, and I mean, this counts for Syria as well, any resolution requires people to try to see things from another point of view, to try to ask how they can move forward, instead of just continually blaming and demonizing each other. I mean, once you've demonized each other for so many decades, well, the only thing you can hope is that people get sick of it and get bored of it and want to move on. But, we see this kind of relentless pattern, and that's kind of what I meant about this almost religious characterization in the United States where the enemy is seen as an illegitimate, almost demonic presence that cannot be bargained with, that cannot be understood, that is impossible to even understand. And therefore, there is only one solution, which becomes, of course, violence. I mean, how else would you deal with a literally almost, demonic presence that surpasses human understanding, right? I mean, in a way, it's really, really crazy. It sounds crazy to talk about it, but it is a kind of a crazy thing that they're doing. We have to recognize that other people have, that they have legitimate interests as well. And, not everyone can always have their own way, but you have to get to the bottom of those and figure out how can we live together halfway peaceably. Like, maybe not everyone will get what they want all of the time, but are we here to try to live together peaceably, or is your attitude, I want it all? Everything's mine. I want it all. Anyone who disagrees with me is per se illegitimate. And I mean, unfortunately, that's the attitude that the United States tends to take. And they generally kind of start these kind of media campaigns against, whoever they don't like at the moment. And they kind of spiral out of control to the point where I believe that people have very warped understanding of what the rest of the world is like living in the United States.
Yeah. That's the problem with America partially, is that our society is one of black and white, that everybody wants a simple answer. This is good, that's bad. There's no in-betweens. There's no, it's like, look at our war on drugs, for example, the approach that was taken back with Nancy Reagan. It's one of the perfect examples of that.
Yeah.
Is that when she said, oh yeah, just say no. Is that you can just say no to all drugs. That's the answer. All drugs are bad. Don't do them. That's as simple as that. They want the most simple fix. They want the most easiest solution. And our whole attitude with war on drugs is perfect. That it's not talking about the differences between they put marijuana and heroin at the same level on Schedule 1, and that's how it's finally starting to change. Finally, they are legalized in different states, and medical is becoming about 30 states have that now. But for many years, that's how it was. And it was many different things. There was foreign policy exemplified with the Cold War and the whole stance that anybody that is, not allied with us must be allied with the Russians, that kind of attitude that later translates into the war on terror, that anybody that's not with us here is supporting our enemies. It's literally what Bush said, is that if you're not with us, you're against us, which is funny because in that same year, this is going to sound pretty geeky, but in Star Wars, remember what Obi-Wan said to Anakin, only a Sith app deals in absolutes.
Yeah, okay, yeah, no, it's true. It's really absolutist, and that's why I say it's almost like a fundamentalist religion in its own right, because it's so absolutist. It's like there's these commandments that must be agreed with, and if you don't agree with them, then you are like a public enemy, basically. It's not diverse. It's the opposite of diverse. It's the opposite of thinking. It's the opposite of the age of reason, really. I mean, we've made technological progress by people reasoning, by people questioning things. Not necessarily in a bad way, just by saying, I don't know, does this make sense? Does that make sense? I'm going to try this out. That's how you make progress, not by demanding that everybody adhere to a certain belief, a certain very arbitrary belief, and then really try to ignore all of the contradictions in that belief, as you're pointing out. I mean, there's a contradiction. The United States has said for a long time that they're having a war on terror and that they're doing everything possible to prevent this war on terror, yet we see obviously ISIS growing and growing, terrorism getting worse and worse and worse. So there's a contradiction there. If you're spending $600 billion a year on your defense budget and your goal is to get rid of terrorism, why is it not happening? Why is the opposite happening? Right? And even if someone were to say, oh, mistakes were made, I'd say that's not good enough. I mean, in that case, you should be fired. Like, it makes no sense whatsoever, this entire scenario, that people are asked to believe instead of looking at the facts. The facts don't support your belief. Your belief must be wrong.
Yeah, it's a lot of and that's another thing that seems to be the case with Americans, is that this faith that, eventually, it's all going to work out, that our whole policy in the Middle East is eventually going to settle out. And I still think that a lot of people believe that they believe that eventually ISIS is going to be totally defeated and everything's going to, there won't be another terror group that'll spawn off of that, and that finally there'll be democracy in these countries that, Iraq and Afghanistan, people believe. I still think they are trusting the process a little bit too much and thinking that obviously it's not working. It's getting worse and worse every year. And you see what happened in Libya. They took out Gaddafi, and now the power vacuum in that place is a disaster. Iraq is a disaster. Yeah. All the places pretty much that the United States has touched in the Middle East are a disaster, and I don't see them fixing the situation in these countries anytime soon. And I don't believe they want to be honest. I believe that they've milked these countries for what they can get. Iraq, that they pretty much divided up into oil provinces, and that's the major thing that they're, one of the major things that they've seeked out of there. Afghanistan, is still going to be always plagued with terrorism. Now they have ISIS, and they have, on top of the other terror groups they used to have. The Middle East is what it should be in the future, is made a cautionary tale for any other regions that the United States wants to get involved with and not trust in the United States to come, quote unquote, help your country, or any other power really of that nature. I feel like in the future, unfortunately, I think the United States might no longer be that country, but they'll just have another one, whether it's China, whether another country, they'll pretty much take that role, or may, if you look at it, though I believe it's going to be, I don't know, it was Britain before the United States. And then I guess you go before Britain, I would have to say, there was Spanish that were also kind of coexisting at the same time. So it's like, it tells me it's going to be either European or maybe something from the Anglo-Saxon. I don't know. Maybe it'll be Australia. I don't know how they would turn into a world power, but I feel like it's maybe their turn. One of these countries, probably another country will take that role. Hopefully not, but I feel like the Middle East has become that cautionary tale that this is literally an entire region that has been totally altered its future because of the foreign policy of the United States. Before, a lot of people try to say that it's always been like this. It hasn't been always like this. If you look prior to 1970s, really, it was a lot. There was still problems. There were still coups in different countries. Sure, there was, there was the violence that happened internally in Iraq. You had a coup in 60-something. You had a coup in the 60s in Syria. But still, even go back to then, is that really was the creeping of the United States foreign policy. It's really when the 70s, 80s, it really hit, and the United States got really involved. They funded Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein started the war with Iran, and then pretty much since the 1980s, yes, it's been like this. When it comes to Syria, however, I wonder, do you think that that the end game for the United States is to just oppose Assad, or do you think this is a much bigger plan? It's not lure Iran maybe into the war. Maybe this is the back door for getting Iran into a war that they can finally, I guess, do their regime change against them as well, a double regime change. And that's what I think is going to happen, or is in their plans. And I think it's been the plans of the think tanks and, people like Council of Foreign Relations have been talking about, is that they want to take out these 7 countries. And Syria and Iran is pretty much the last 2 of the countries they want to take out. And if they can lure Iran into the war, I think they're planning that they can try to take out those 2 regimes at once. Wesley Clark laid out his plan, or laid out the plan that had been laid out to him 10 years ago. That he was going to take out 7 countries in 5 years. It was Syria, Iraq, Iran, Yemen, which Yemen, you see they've destabilized that country to the point where they're in total chaos as well. That's pretty much as close to regime changes that they're going to get. Sudan, Libya, pretty much most of those countries have been checked off, but Syria and Iran been the holdouts to the plan for the Middle East. Do you think that the United States just wants to oppose Assad, or may just continue to stabilize the country? What do you think is their ultimate end game, if there even is an end game here?
Yeah, if I could say what has been a characteristic of U.S. foreign policy for the last one while is really surrounding Russia. So really, Syria and Iran have both often been allies of the former Soviet Union. Syria had a particularly close relationship with both Iran and the Soviet Union, and they also did a lot of work on, supporting Hezbollah and, so on and so forth. So, of course, the idea in the U.S. is people would say, oh, goodness, that means they're an axis of evil, and they're, of course, terrible, and everything they do is terrible. I would say, well, they're kind of the flip side of a conflict of which the United States is on the other side of that, right? It doesn't necessarily make them evil. It just means that they're a different set of countries with a different set of alliances, and a somewhat different set of goals, although ultimately kind of not even really a different set of goals just, I suppose, once more in their particular national interests. But yeah, I think for the United States, getting rid of Syria, knocking out Syria and Iran serves a whole ream of purposes. It gets rid of, it opens up Iran again, obviously, to investments from them. And at the same time, it knocks out basically the part, I would say axis, for lack of a better word, of the region that kind of opposed the American, Saudi-Israel kind of complex, or broad alliance. So you're kind of basically, trying to get rid of your opposing forces in one goal. And I would say that over the last 10 years, what the United States has done is really kind of try to surround Russia and limit its expansion, if I could put it that way, and to try to cut off, traditional Russian allies, kind of one at a time, basically. And also, incidentally, anyone who has a long-standing opposition to the United States. So, don't forget, before Iran was what it was, there was, an emperor who was, had an extremely negative reputation within Iran, which is why he was deposed. So we're not going from a situation. I think the idea in America, this kind of weird, unsaid communication in America, is that everything was wonderful, when Iran was a wonderful place, and then Ayatollah Khomeini came along, and now it's been terrible, and they have Sharia law. But, that is not actually the case. This is not the historical development, just as it was not the historical development in Libya or anywhere else. I mean, these countries have their own historical development. The U.S. has, from time to time, interfered in that development. I mean, other large countries, as you're saying, may well do the same in that situation. What we have to ask ourselves, and I think this, maybe getting to the point here, is what can we do to prevent that? In the United States, we've seen a great opportunity where the United States was the sole superpower in the world for the last 30 years and had the opportunity to do a lot of good in the world. We've seen that totally squandered. The United States, in fact, becoming, unfortunately, a really negative force in the world. Yes, and as you're saying, perhaps more negatively even than previously, although it's kind of hard to say. And we should ask ourselves, okay, if that's not the case, if American people are not happy with that, what can they do to change it? Well, a big issue is, of course, the leaders of the United States, have been allowed to get away without having accountability for their decisions. I mean, if you invaded Libya and it's a mess, and you invaded Iraq and it's a mess, and you're invading Syria and it's a mess, then someone has to be held accountable for that. But the system as such kind of allows you not to be held accountable. It allows you to do crazy things, really crazy things, and then kind of walk away and go, oh, well, I guess things didn't turn out as I thought they would. That really can't happen. And the reason it's allowed to happen is because the United States isn't really a democracy. It's an oligarchy, which is, regulated by elections occasionally that aren't really fair at all, that aren't very transparent, that are fought out almost completely within this oligarchy that the vast majority of Americans do not have a share in. So I think really that is at the root of the problem. And I think when we look at the future and we say, who will be in charge? We don't know. Maybe the United States, maybe China. I don't know. I really think that the key to getting out of this continual repetition of large countries taking advantage of their situation to do terrible things to smaller countries is to move to a more democratic way of life where the people have control over what occurs.
And it's the ironic thing, though, that the United States tries to act like not only that they are a democratic country and that they truly follow the principles of democracy, but they try to make it seem like they're the shining example and that really that the American way of democracy is the best way of democracy in the world, which is far from true. There's definitely more democratic elements inside the United States. I'll give them that on maybe local levels and stuff like that in other countries. But this whole idea that the rest of the world is undemocratic compared to the United States, or that you have countries, even the ones that they say are total dictatorships, really still have elements of democracy oftentimes. Yeah. For example, like in Cuba, you might not be able to pick the leader of the country, but the mayor and all the other stuff is often votable, and they have elections for those people, all the local people. Even or like Libya, it's like, yes, Gaddafi was in power for the 42 years, but however, almost all the people around him, all like the Jamahiriya, they called it, the parliament, was all voted on by the people. So there was ultimately a democracy, a limited democracy, but still there's democratic elements. It wasn't completely devoid of democracy. like they try to say. And, I think that democracy probably doesn't really exist in any country around the world. There's always going to be oligarch elements, it seems like, or in different countries, because of circumstances, they have, dictatorships. And a lot of times they're benevolent, like what happened. I would say Libya was more of a benevolent dictatorship. There's Tito and stuff like that. The people generally do pretty fine under those types of systems. And there's awful dictatorships like we've seen with people like Pinochet, what we've seen with people like Francisco Franco, that are just there because they've been planted by the United States. Or there was also some people on the other side during the Cold War, for sure, that were planted by the Soviet Union, that were just there to keep control of a country for a larger imperial power and for their own power that they have obtained because of that.
Well, the problem is when you're looking at centralized power like that, then, whatever form it takes, the problem is that, little individuals are not very important to that process, and they don't have very much say. And that's why you see these large countries or powerful individuals often, starting wars, draining people, doing what they like, because the truth is you're not very important in this equation. You're kind of superfluous to this entire equation. So when you talk about democracy, this is my area of specialization because that's what I wrote my PhD on and where I'm active in today, would be saying, you can have democracy, but if you look on democracy as elections, then you won't have it. The ancient Greeks who came up with this idea of democracy didn't like elections very much. They preferred to have everybody decide things, decide things collectively. And they liked officials, and their officials didn't have very much power, but they liked the officials that they did have to be chosen randomly. So this was actually like a completely different system than the one we call democracy today. What we call democracy today actually came from the Roman Republic. And at that time, no one thought it was democracy. Like the Romans would go around saying, of course we don't have democracy. It's ridiculous to have democracy. The common people should never be in charge. Only the richest and most powerful members of society should be in charge. And they had, elections quite similarly to us. They passed legislation somewhat similarly to us. And in some ways, they involve people more in passing legislation than we do today. But the key problem is that we live in a time when we have enormous countries. They have enormous wealth. They have enormous militaries. I don't believe that if ordinary people are not in control of that, I don't believe much good will ever come of it. The best you can hope for is a benevolent dictatorship in that case. But often you won't get it. And the reason is that a system that doesn't depend on the ordinary person won't ultimately serve the ordinary person. And that's why our interests are not being taken into account. It doesn't serve our interest in order to, invade Libya and leave it in ruins. Obviously not. It doesn't serve our interest to invade Iraq and leave it in ruins or to allow ISIS to flourish in Iraq. Of course it doesn't. It's hard to think of something less in the interest of the average person than this. Yet it happens because we are superfluous to the system and not involved in power all of the time. If you only have elections every 4 years, you can get away with anything.
Yeah, the idea of elections, really, when you think about it, here in America, two very rich people that they're pretty much the same that we vote for, and then they have pretty much total power for the next 4 to 8 years. There's no election, but nowadays it seems like the re-election's the trend. People that get elected are just re-elected because they feel like, I'll just stick with the evil that I know rather than the evil that I don't know, especially with Congress to be true. 90% of of Congress gets re-elected. And you have people that have been there for 40 years just because they're the name that's known, and people want to pick the person that it's better than it get possibly even worse with another person.
Well, it's worse than that, actually, because in the United States, you have extreme gerrymandering. So what's happened is that a lot of these districts have been drawn and redrawn in order to crack up, minorities who are in those districts, to ensure that the district kind of remains pure in a way, almost that it remains a pure Republican or a pure Democratic district. So what's happening is you have this manipulation of districts, and a lot of the time for that reason, they're not even contested. Or they're not really contested, because sometimes there'll be a token candidate put up, but the party won't fund them because they know they're not going to win. So a lot of the time, there's virtually no choice. You're not even having a competitive election. And then on top of that, the first past the post system, the electoral system that's used in the United States, is very skewed. There's all kinds of wasted votes. So when you go to the polling station, your vote probably won't, actually, statistically, probably won't read anywhere. It's that messed up. It sounds like, one person, one vote, that makes sense, but when you look at it mathematically, it actually doesn't at all. It's very, very twisted. I mean, you've seen, for example, Trump lost the popular vote but won the election. George W. Bush lost the popular vote but won the election. So, that's just two examples of this happening. It happens a lot because it's a statistically flawed way of making decisions. So it's even worse than you think. It's not just, I think that the tendency in political discourse is to blame people and to say, oh, well, people wanted this or people wanted that. But when you look at it, they often didn't. They often didn't even have a real choice because everything has been pre-decided on this level. And a lot of the time, as I said, they don't even put up an opposing candidate, or they put someone up who's a token, who they don't give any funding, and who therefore is unable to contest the election directly. So it's deeper than you think. And I think this kind of thing of kind of like blaming people, I get it. I get that that's to some extent true, that there are a lot of people who aren't that politically interested, but I would say politicians don't even leave that to chance.
Yeah. The gerrymandering says it all, doesn't it? Is that, instead of the people picking the representative gets to pick the people who vote for him.
Exactly, precisely.
Ridiculous.
Yeah.
And I've seen some examples of this. For example, instead of like an even square of, whatever, 20 by 20 mile area for the district, it's all jagged and you got, parts sticking out way far away from the rest of it. You got like singular houses that are like a mile away from everything else that are put into these districts.
Absolutely.
And then they get to redraw these districts pretty much whenever they want. It's absurd. And this is the Congress, this is the Senate. These are supposed to be some of the most important, are practically our entire legislative body of our country, where they get to pretty much pick who votes for them. So these people always stay in the power, and that's why we have people that have been here since. I think there's one congressman that's been in power since 1972. Which, when you think about that, that's the year that Nixon was reelected. 45 years.
Yeah, they have safe seats, right? Their seats totally safe. So, and in a system where you only have two parties, they feel that, I have you in a trap because you don't have anywhere else to go. I mean, you have to agree with our party platform completely, or you have to go over to the other side and agree with their platform completely. But there's nothing in between. So that's why that also allows them to be so sure of their voters. If you had a different electoral system, for example, we have different electoral systems in Europe, you tend to get a lot smaller parties. So at least, although it's also a very flawed system in many ways, at least you have a choice between, 5 or 6 or more candidates. Like in my riding in the last election, there were like 15 candidates. So people have more choice, and you can't be as sure of your voters in that situation, which helps make politicians at least somewhat more responsive to their voters. It's still imperfect. It's still not, I believe, the ultimate solution to this, but I think it's certainly much better than the situation in the United States.
Yeah, and I want to go to your neck of the woods, actually, which I know you actually live in Ireland, but it's right there, the United Kingdom. I said we would talk about it at some point, is Corbyn. And what's going on over there, it's very interesting because it's like it's quite different situation. It's like they have this hung parliament and everything, and Theresa May's still the prime minister, but, a lot of people are saying that she's going to resign at some point, and that her power is just temporary. And a lot of people are saying that Corbyn's eventually going to become the prime minister. What do you think is... honestly, I don't really even comprehend. I mean, the hung parliament thing, I don't want to admit it, but I don't really know what exactly that means. Could you explain to me and my listeners what exactly is the situation over there?
Okay, yeah. So in Britain, I'm actually originally from Canada, and the British and the Canadian parliament systems are pretty much identical. So we don't have a president. What we do is when we vote for the parliament, which is like the House of Congress, those people then elect a prime minister from among them. So the person who becomes the prime minister is the leader of the party that won the most seats in the last election. So it's like as if you would just have a congressional election, and then if the Democrats got the most seats, then they would elect the president. basically, like that. That's how it works. So what's happened in this election is that no one has won enough seats to be the single biggest party to have over 50% of the seats. So no party has more than 50% of the seats, and they cannot agree really on who should be the next prime minister. Now, what has happened in practice is this. Theresa May and the Conservatives, who have more seats than anyone else, even though it's not 50%, have decided to make agreement with one of the unionist parties in Northern Ireland. Now, no one saw this coming because Northern Ireland is really peripheral to the United Kingdom, obviously, and up until now has not played a role in politics in the sense of getting elected. I mean, they played a big role in politics, but not through elections. Okay, and this in turn has created a big problem. I mean, this is huge news here, because if the Unionist Party agrees to support Theresa May and to support the government of the United Kingdom, then technically speaking, she can form another government because they will vote for her. They will say, okay, she should be the leader, she should be the prime minister. There will be enough votes for her to become the prime minister if this goes ahead. However, no one knows how long it will last because this particular combination has never been tried before, and because the Unionist Party has its own interests. One of those interests is, of course, they do not want Northern Ireland to stop being part of the United Kingdom and to join with the Republic of Ireland. But of course, many people in Northern Ireland want exactly that to happen. They want Northern Ireland to join the Republic of Ireland. And in the Good Friday Agreement, they agreed that there must be possible to have a referendum in which Northern Ireland can decide to join the Republic of Ireland. That's the part of the peace process. This is a big issue of why there was a peace process and why, the Republican side basically disarmed during that because of this promise that this would happen. So if the Unionist Party is de facto in power, well, no matter what's being said, I think most people here in Ireland say, we know that they don't want a referendum. We know that they're probably going to block a referendum. And therefore, Sinn Féin, which was the political arm of the IRA, has said that they're very skeptical of whether or not the peace process can continue under these circumstances. So that's one big thing that's coming out of this. And this is a consequence of this so-called Hun Parliament, in which no side has enough votes on its own to choose who the prime minister is. But Jeremy Corbyn, who's now the leader of the Labour Party, didn't win nearly enough seats to form the government on his own, even together with the Scottish National Party, which is the obvious choice to become a coalition. They don't have enough seats. So if it collapses, there'll probably just be more elections. And in that case, he has very good chances. Labour has very good chances because I think they really have the momentum behind them.
So, yeah, I get that now. The Unionist Party, I heard them literally, they've been labeled, I saw by some of the left-wing leaning people in the UK, they said that these people are former terrorists. How true is that some of the people that were in the...
It's like a thing. There is, I suppose people would say, terrorists on both sides of this conflict that went on for a very long time in Northern Ireland. And I mean, some of the violence was associated with Republican forces, but a lot of the violence was also associated with Unionist and Protestant forces. I mean, that's not something that gets a lot of airtime, but it's true that there is a lot of violence on both sides. So, yes, they are, there's not a big area, so there certainly was a lot of violence perpetrated on both sides of that equation, including on the Unionist side. Sounds weird that there would be violence for something kind of as conservative as wanting to stay part of the UK, but there was. So, that's kind of beyond dispute,
Well,
I mean, but it's always thrown at both sides in any conversation about Northern Ireland, so.
Well, it doesn't seem too odd to me that there was violence over wanting to stay part of the UK. Remember, is that I got roots back in Colombia, and there's violent groups formed over the price of coconuts going too high. I mean, there's a paramilitary we formed over anything, and there's the idea that was pretty prevalent. Is that because, generally a lot of the people that were fighting for the Republic against the UK were left-leaning, and in Colombia, when we had the problems with the guerrillas, that there were a lot of groups that were extreme on the other side. There were far-right groups that would be hunting down communists and stuff like that, and they would often go to extreme lengths, such as, like killing the family members of people that were involved, but they weren't even involved. All kinds, or like going into villages where people were associated with the, M19 stuff like that, and just shooting up everyone because the village was deemed as a communist village and stuff like that. It doesn't surprise me that the right wing can be also violent over there in North Ireland. Corbyn, going back to him, it seems like there's a lot of momentum behind him, and from what I've read about him, what I've seen him talk about, it seems that he's definitely not politics as usual when it comes to his stance. I mean, when it comes to Palestine, it actually is not gibberish what he's talking about. It actually seems to be, the Israel-Palestine situation. He actually seems to want justice for the Palestinians to at least a certain extent, compared to most Western politicians that's practically non-existent in their minds, and they're just pretty much towing the pro-Israel line. He doesn't do that so much. He is also when it comes to foreign policy in general, he has a quite different stance than most large Western politicians. So I wonder what you think about all that.
No, I really like Corbyn. I think he's really good. I think he's kind of the first real politician in a long time. Because what happened is that Labour wasn't winning elections, so what happened is that Tony Blair basically sold out the Labour Party and became New Labour, which was essentially like the Conservative Party. So what happened is that a lot of people in Britain ended up with hardly anyone to vote for, and in fact, the voter turnout nosedived to the year 2000, because it was like a choice between the same, two parties that were more or less the same. Like the Labour Party got right in with big business, and they were, privatizing the NHS, the National Health Service, and doing all the things that the Conservatives normally did. So that went on for some time, and there was just this, again, media onslaught that this is the only way to do things and the only way that makes sense, and it's just ridiculous, and one can't expect a health service in this day and age. Well, of course you can't if you're going to allow, I think it's £35 billion of tax avoidance every year in the UK. I mean, right? Exactly. They started letting people get away with all kinds of tax avoidance, tax evasion, and of course they lost the money to pay for the social services. Now, Corbyn is different. He's very much back into nationalizing some of these services that traditionally were nationally owned. I think he has a really good, for a guy who is, he's no spring chicken, but he definitely understands the problems facing younger people today. And in fact, he has huge support among younger voters, especially 18 to 24-year-olds. Why? Because they can't get a job. They can't afford anywhere to live. And they don't know what can the future hold for them, right? Just a lot of job insecurity, a lot of being treated very badly by employers, really just being treated like they're superfluous. Rising student fees, which is another thing that's been happening in the UK. And Corbyn is opposed to all of that, which most young people think is terrific. And as you point out, he's also very open on foreign policy. He was protesting in favor of Nelson Mandela at a time when Margaret Thatcher was, helping to hold up the apartheid regime. I mean, he's really been on the right side of history for a long time. The only thing that amazes me is that he managed to stay in the Labour Party for as long as he did. I'm really surprised he didn't get kicked out before this, but clearly he didn't. And however, what has happened is he's been extremely demonized in the press around the world, in the United Kingdom and also in America. I'm really shocked at some of the things I've read about him in papers in the U.S. where he's being denounced as a vile person. I mean, I don't know what he's done that has been vile. He's actually been a very good and considerate kind of leader. But he was really demonized in the press, and in fact, a lot of the MPs who were elected and who were engaged in, one could say corruption themselves, tried to get rid of him. So the grassroots of the party voted for him. The establishment didn't like him at all. And even left-wing newspapers like The Guardian really came out very, very, very strongly against him. And they were continually saying that he was incompetent and that he was terrible and this, that, and the next thing, right? Because they were trying to get rid of him. They were trying to get the party itself to get rid of him. And in a way, the election that was called when it was almost a blessing in disguise for him. Because when they unveiled their policies, it turned out that, lo and behold, those policies were very popular among most people. That, strangely enough, most people didn't want to, reduce taxes on the rich. That most people do think that people should have a right to an affordable, at least, education. That older people should be cared for, that people shouldn't be forced to do internships for free. You know, these are things that actually people have, the vast majority of people have in common. And Corbyn basically came along and managed to put that in a party manifesto, and people said, yeah, that's right, that's exactly what we want. Thanks very much. So he won a large number of seats. You know, he increased the seat share of Labour by a lot, and I think he will probably do even better if there's another election in the near future, because people are beginning to realize, yeah, you know, this has a chance, and that's the kind of society we want to live in. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's what I'm surprised is that they came back from the abyss. You know, the Labour Party in general is that when Blair was there, when he brought about New Labour, and he pretty much just turned it into just like the Tories.
Yeah.
And then how they were able to, you know, pull the party back to the left is pretty surprising, because I've seen all across the Western world, it seems like there's been a lot of the opposite, really, that, you know, the supposed left-wing parties of the country getting pulled to the right in different countries. And, for example, you see that like in Canada and stuff like that, is that what used to be considered, you know, left is now really far left. You know, like Elizabeth May was really kind of like what some of the liberal politicians were many years ago, and now they've all shifted more to the right. Canada's like that. The United States is definitely, even though that we don't really have politicians that represented the political or the public opinion of left versus right, that they think, you know, somebody talking like Bernie Sanders was way too far left. Many people thought that, when really that wasn't left at all, really. That was really just barely left the center, if anything. And the whole Western hemisphere seems to have really went to the right in recent years. And you also see that how these people like Trump and, you know, really shockingly in the Netherlands, Geert Wilders, were able to get so much public support. These people that years ago would have just been like, these people are fascists, we're not going to support these. But people nowadays are like, oh yeah, whatever, we'll just support them because, you know, we have to keep those immigrants out. People are, you know, with all the hysteria about immigrants and terrorism, have been shifted to the right. But it's good to see in the UK that I see the people seem to start to be rejecting that nonsense that a lot of people in America believe right now. And, you know, it's crazy that, you know, people that have been mainstreamed in the recent years, these absolutely repugnant figures. You know, Trump is actually not that far right compared to some of the other people that became mainstream, like conservative commentators in the last few years. You know, you have people like, or that became figures in the conservative movement. You know, people like Sheriff Arpaio or whatever, the guy out in Arizona that, you know, literally would keep people out in tents at 140 degrees. There'd be 120 degrees outside. Inside the tents, it'd be like 140 degrees. And these prisoners would be held out there. And he would do all kinds of sadistic punishments. He was known for that. And, you know, he's became kind of like a figure that I see a lot of times people will be sharing stuff like, oh, yeah, this is how we should handle immigrants or whatever. You know, or you have Sheriff Clark up in Milwaukee, that he actually got appointed to a department. He was going to be part of the head of the Department of Homeland Security under Trump, but he turned it down. But his jails are known to be pretty bad. I mean, recently they had like 4 people died in his jails from just mistreatment inside of them. So it's good to see that at least somewhere the general public is a little bit more sane, and then the UK people are realizing, are not going on for politics of fear, because that's pretty much what I've noticed a lot of the Western world. And it's a perfect thing for the elites to control the people with fear. The boogeyman is going to get you. The terrorists are going to get you. The immigrants are going to get you. All these different fears have compounded into a very paranoid society in the United States. And there seems to be more of this belief in the United States amongst one segment of the population, that everyone's out to get the United States. That America doesn't have any true allies, and that America has to do what it takes in order for it to win. And that's a scary belief, because it's pretty much, you know, when you think back in the 30s in Europe, it's pretty much how it was in, you know, the belief in Italy and Germany is that we've been pretty much ostracized by the entire world. Now we have to do what it takes to get our country back on top. But there's also some people in the United States. I realize that there's definitely people in the United States that have woken up to this and wish that they could have a candidate that actually truly represents people and wanted to change the entire economic system that we have in the United States and bring about programs that could help poor people, help out the disadvantaged. But, and Corbyn, really, when you think about it, isn't that far left himself, but it's definitely a refreshing change.
Yeah, it's like most of what he's proposing is like back to maybe like the early 80s, right? I mean, it's not, he's actually proposing things that have existed in Britain during people's lifetimes. So, yes, I mean, I think the problem is things start to get muddled because there's we're not adapting as we need to changes in our society. So all kinds of issues start to be thrown into the pot. Is it immigration? Is it terrorism? Is it the economy? What is going on? I think the issue is that in a lot of places, including in the UK, we've basically said it has to be business as usual. There's business as usual, and that's it. And that anyone who doesn't stick to that business as usual is going to be demonized. And I mean, this absolutely happened to Corbyn. I mean, maybe it probably didn't get over to the United States, but this man was subjected to terrible abuse in the newspapers for months and months and months and months and months and months and months. I mean, the fact that he's in favor of, he said Osama bin Laden should have been put on trial. I mean, and he says that, there should be a settlement with Northern Ireland, a peaceful settlement. I mean, this has been parlayed into he supports terrorists. Like, that's ridiculous. So he's really, and not only that, I mean, just terrible, awful, awful, awful things have been said about him again and 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 again. And, we're sick of hearing about what a terrible, terrible person he is. So I think that if that's going to be your response, if the response of the middle, as it is to demonize anyone in really terrible, terrible terms, then you're going to end up, the only people who are going to withstand that, or most of the people who are going to be able to withstand that over time, are going to be people like Donald Trump who just don't care. I mean, that's just it. You get, like, the thing about the fascist end of things, or the very nationalist side of things, are those people who just don't care if people say bad things about them, And that's why they keep going, because they just don't care. But I think for the average person, and I really don't know how Corbyn withstood it for so long, I guess because he had a lot of grassroots support, but I think it's very, very hard for most people to read these terrible, terrible things about them in the media all the time, and he was being made responsible. They would say, well, Labour will fail, and it will all be his fault. It's his fault, because they'll do disastrously at the elections, and he's going to bring down the entire left side of British politics, and, he's basically personally responsible for the Tories being in government, and on and on and on and on and on. And, I mean, it was a ridiculous, ridiculous onslaught that he was subjected to. It's been proven totally wrong. I mean, it was very, very personal, very, very, very personally directed at him. His entire private life, of course, was, everything he'd ever done, which, really wasn't much, was, dug up. And, he was a terrible person because he wanted to send his children to a public school instead of a private school, and his wife had divorced him over this, and he was a terrible, terrible person for it, on and on and on and on and on and on and on. And as I'm saying, like, if you're going to do that, if the reaction of the middle is to club viciously anyone who disagrees with them, then you'll end up with the people who don't care surviving. Proportionately, it will tend to be that way. That they'll just say, I don't care, because they're fascists, they're racist. They don't care. So they're just going to keep plugging, and you've kind of destroyed your constructive opposition. I mean, look at what happened to Bernie. Bernie actually had a lot of momentum, too. Bernie should have been the candidate against Trump. But as we now know, the Democratic Party went to great lengths to ensure that he wouldn't be the candidate. So these constructive kind of threads exist as well in the United States. But if you're going to get clubbed to death over it, then you're going to end up only with negative alternatives.
Well, we all know what happened to the whistleblower on from the Bernie Sanders camp, Seth Rich, who ended up getting gunned down suspiciously. To me, it's pretty obvious that the DNC definitely rigged it in favor of Hillary, and I think that the whole election plan was to put these two candidates against each other. What's weird is that I thought the entire election that Hillary was going to be the one that the elites would want compared to Donald Trump. I didn't think that they would want this renegade candidate in the White House, but I guess they had a little bit different plan, and Trump became the president. But yeah, if it was Sanders versus Trump, that would have been pretty hard to justify saying that, oh yeah, Trump won somehow against Sanders. People wouldn't even have believed it, because Sanders was, I think, an election between Trump and Sanders would have won by 65 to 35 or something like that.
Yeah,
the whole showed like a landslide victory for him.
he had a lot of momentum. I mean, those are the policies people want, and, he wasn't getting a lot of airtime. Like, I also feel like the media didn't give Sanders, this consideration as a serious candidate a lot of the time, and I was very disappointed about that. But I think, similar to Corbyn, the more people heard about Corbyn, the more they liked him. And I think that probably would have gone in a similar way with Bernie. So the more people heard about what he was really saying, instead of just these attacks, on his character or on him in general, the more people heard about his policies, the more people liked him. And that explains why he started off 25 points behind the Conservative Party and ended up neck and neck with them.
I was looking through while we were talking about Corbyn, I was looking through all these different, scare articles about Corbyn. They're pretty funny. This one is from one of my favorite news sources, Breitbart.com. This is the headline they actually put up. Corbyn goes full socialism, doubles down on Chavez-style illegal property seizures in London.
Right.
And it shows Corbyn in front of a communist flag. I guess, it's from the Communist Party Great Britain flag in front of him. I guess one of the people that support him had it at one of his rallies or something.
Yeah.
And then it goes on to say, Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn has reiterated his style, call for Venezuela-style property requisitions in London to house people who lost their homes to the Grenfell Tower fire.
Yeah, so they're still going after him.
Of course, I picked the worst one. Breitbart is, Breitbart is funny in itself because they'll talk about they talk about how the United States foreign policy is flawed and everything, but then they'll still justify all this hatred towards people like the Iranian regime or the Venezuelan regime. It's pretty much like they contradict themselves so much in their own hatred that it's pretty much like a comedy piece, honestly.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's terrible. It's terrible. And I mean, I find really hilarious is how much media pundits complain about social media. But frankly, I mean, although not everything on social media is sane, I have to say it's generally more sane than mainstream media.
Yeah, Breitbart didn't used to be in the mainstream as much, but I think with the recent last 2 years or so, now Breitbart's almost became it's quasi mainstream almost. It's just pretty much like an extreme version of Fox News or something. And they get some of their justification. I remember for a long time, one of the things we're not hateful. Look, we have this gay guy. We have Milo Yiannopoulos. How could we not be hateful if we have him on our staff?
Yeah,
and then he had the whole controversy about him. And then 2 days later he resigned. But we literally had the guy that ran Breitbart as the White House chief strategist.
Yeah.
I mean, he banned him. So became mainstream.
It's not just Breitbart. There were the Guardian went full throttle after Jeremy Corbyn too, and so did, and they've done the same over Julian Assange. I read every time something happens concerning Julian Assange, the Guardian runs 3 or 4 actual hit pieces on him. I mean, they've even had to retract some of it. I'm not talking, critical or something like that. I mean, hit pieces, where you just try to take the person down and smear their character, and you're not even really saying anything. These are opinion pieces that are just speculating on, Assange or Corbyn's life, really. There's no proof, there's no facts, there's no news, but they're clearly there in order to give people a certain impression of that person. So really, I really think that's something that needs to be corrected, and I know this sounds quite drastic, but I don't really think people should be allowed to print whatever they like about someone, regardless of the truth. I think, in Germany, if you spread a falsehood about someone, or if you print a falsehood in a paper, then that paper must retract that. You have to take them to court. But usually you don't even need to go as far as court. You just send them a letter saying, this thing you published about me is untrue, and I would like you to print a retraction, and if you don't print a retraction, I'm going to take you to court. Because I think the thing where people just print what they like has gone on long enough. I think it's very harmful. I really don't think there's any way to control this short of starting to enforce, libel and slander laws, which are meant to protect you. I mean, you also have a right to be protected against people telling point-blank lies about you.
Yeah, definitely. This isn't fair journalism either. This is literally the Express, which I know is this is the mainstream of Britain. This is one of the top 5 newspapers, if I'm wrong, right?
Well, depends what you mean by top, but okay. Maybe most widely read, sure.
Well, I'm saying most read. I'm not talking about like fair and balanced. No, I'm not saying that. Because this is literally the article that they had about Corbyn. Stupid and dangerous Corbyn, savage as he fails to condemn Day of Rage protest march. And then it says, Chairman Corbyn has come under fire yet again after he failed to condemn a Day of Rage march when thousands of militants plan to bring down the government.
This is their favorite, is saying that you have to condemn this or you have to condemn that. It's something here, too. Like, I read recently a press release from a party that was going on about how Sinn Féin hasn't condemned Venezuela. Like, why do they need to? Why, this kind of pushing people to condemn things is kind of the newest rage. And the idea is that it's right to condemn things. But, I mean, if you're a representative, you have to represent all of society. Like, you're supposed to be representing people. You're supposed to care about people who you don't necessarily agree with. You're supposed to hear people's grievances, not just to condemn people that you yourself are responsible for, right? So this is ridiculous. It's a ridiculous point of view. But you're right. What makes him stupid and what makes him dangerous? What makes him a supporter of terrorism? I mean, to say that someone is supporting terrorism is, I think, that definitely crosses the line. I mean, that's something that can be proven. I mean, has he been found in a court of law to support terrorism? Is he a member of a terrorist organization? If that's not true, then I don't think you should be allowed to say that someone is supporting terrorism, and similar with all of the other claims. So we really, I mean, like, that journalistic standards don't exist. I mean, like, that's like not even necessary to say at this point in time. Unfortunately, it's too bad. There used to be, a standard of ethics that you had to comply with, and a standard of good journalism, where you have to find sources and you have to verify those sources. And things that are opinion should be clearly marked as opinion. But even opinion should have a rational basis. You may disagree with my conclusions or my view of the situation, but at least I'm giving you some facts, and you can question those facts. Or you can say, I don't think those facts add up to the conclusions you're making. That would be furthering a conversation, furthering a dialogue. Obviously, the purpose here is not to further a dialogue. It's merely to paint someone black. And I do really think that there should be either an overhaul of these laws, or they should just be better enforced, because it's not okay to smear someone like that. You're infringing on their rights to their reputation and their private life and their good name. You're destroying their good name with lies, and I really don't think that should be allowed.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even our First Amendment, it says that there's freedom of expression, freedom of press, and I believe that 100%. I believe that ultimately is our freedom of expression has been heavily hindered to the average person. What they can, talk about is definitely the newspapers, what they can go to. And the newspapers, often in the media and all the, the mainstream media as a whole, they're able to put out total falsehoods, smear, and do libel, which is not supposed to be allowed via the Constitution. It's unconstitutional to spread libel. It's not part of your protected free speech to libel anyone, and that's what you see with Corbyn. Is just at a certain point it becomes libel, and we've seen this with different politicians in the United States, like Ron Paul. He was a victim of definitely hyperbole and libel and many other things. That yes, there was definitely flaws or mistakes he made, but they made very reaching claims. For example, claimed that Ron Paul was a racist and that Ron Paul hated Jews and stuff like that. And in reality, Ron Paul did say some questionable things 30 years ago and one time, but his voting record, his record as a person, his record as a doctor really didn't show any signs of him being a bigoted or hateful person. But they did that to keep Ron Paul down, I think. And Ron Paul actually had a lot of momentum going into the 2012 campaign. And at one point, it looked like Ron Paul had, if it wasn't a rigged system, that Ron Paul had a chance of potentially winning the primaries when it was these seemingly weak candidates. He had Mitt Romney. He had all the money behind him. He still was not liked by too many people. It was more like, we'll just take him because he's not Obama. That was the attitude amongst many Republicans.
Yeah.
Ron Paul, it was people like, he's really somebody that seems to be actually talking a vision, not just some banalities and formed into a speech about how he's going to do this or how he's going to do that. Ron Paul actually had a vision of what seemed to be a more hands-off government and also a hands-off with the rest of the world. That was one of the major reasons that I liked Ron Paul. was because of his approach on foreign policy, which is not get involved with all this stuff. It doesn't involve us. Let's use the military for defense and not for offense over in this war on terrorism, which is, what the hell is a war on terrorism? You can't fight terror with terror because you're just going to make more terrorists. And that's what's happened, is that a lot of times our drone strikes have caused more terrorists to become terrorists than some of the clerics and other methods that you think would cause terrorism. So going back, though, to the point about mainstream media and how they are able to get away with this stuff, is that they're held to the standards nowadays. That back in the day, people held them to a little bit higher standards, and that's why it was so biased that, talk about back in the days of Walter Cronkite, or before that, the 60s and 70s. But there was a little bit more demand for a little bit more fair and balanced nature to the news. Nowadays, it's not that. Nowadays, they just want to hear, people tune into Fox and they want to hear what they want to hear. So Fox gives that to them. They get to hear a bunch of conservative banalities about, oh yeah, we need to do this. Trump's doing a great job. Oh, it's just these people are really responsible for Trump not doing a good job. You turn into MSNBC, Trump's Hitler, Trump's responsible for everything, Trump's Satan. You go to CNN, and then it's just a bunch of stuff about, oh yeah, Russia's involved in this, Russia's causing all the problems, Russia's Satan, Russia's devil. Yeah, it's like they got a different media channel for whatever you want to hear, and that's what it seems to be. It's what people want to hear because they belong to whatever subscribed mindset, is that either the left is responsible for everything, the right's responsible for everything. In reality, when you think about politics in America, it's not even really left versus right. It's more like far right versus slightly less far right. That's how I see American politics. It's really very lack of variety, and there's no real left in America, no political left. There's definitely people that belong to the left, but a real political left has been absent for many, many years. And I'm talking about at least 50 years, maybe even going back, I would say the 50s probably. When they were
they've kind of written left-wing ideas, by which, maybe economically progressive ideas, out of the equation, right? The idea has been that we all agree that we're not going to do that we're just going to have a very laissez-faire market approach, and what happens, happens. And the haves continue to haves, and the have-nots continue to have not. But that's the only way things can be this way, and this is a smart way to do things, and it's right, because, the GDP is up and things like that. So they're not dealing with the real concerns of people. I mean, most people are, per definition, not rich, which means, I suppose, that in a democracy, it would always be, I suppose, what we would call somewhat more left-wing. I don't even really think of this as being left-wing. I just think of it as a sensible way to organize a society in which all people have the ability to reach their potential, at least theoretically, at least a chance. And we don't have that anymore. Even access to education in America is something that's cut off to most people. I think it would probably not even make sense for most people to try to pursue it at this point because the costs far outweigh the benefits. And we have a situation where, yes, there's great inequality as far as wages, where some people's work is not valued at all. This has come about to some extent by destroying the unions and also by automatization of work, also destroying unions and trade treaties as well. Because trade treaties, of course, allowed work to be outsourced overseas, where conditions are very, very cheap, where people did not have the same protections, the same legal protections as people in the United States, and therefore they were exploited by large companies. And then those people who ran those large companies are heralded as great business people, when really all they have done is take advantage of other people's weak position and vulnerable situation to make a lot of money off of them. So the problem is really that the entire left narrative has been written out. And I think one thing that really puzzles me, I sometimes wonder, is that a lot of people who are very prominent in that area, like let's say Naomi Klein, for example, have really moved over to really seem to focus on the environment as their only issue now. This seems to have really become kind of a cause célèbre. And it's not that I don't think that the environment is a very important issue. I just feel that I don't really see how this issue can be dealt with without dealing with the problems at the center of society. And the problem at the center of society is a lack of equality and a lack of democracy. So I do feel that a lot of people who are quite prominent and quite successful, like in also these newspapers, The Guardian, New Statesman, things like that, have kind of abdicated their willingness to deal with those hard issues and are instead kind of focusing on the feel-good issues. like the environment, where everyone can agree, oh yeah, we should be good, we should be, environmentally friendly. Like, that's something where you don't get a lot of opposition, but they're not cracking through on those issues where they'll have opposition. Like, why are you allowing tax evasion and tax avoidance? Why are you allowing a situation to be created where people who come from well-off families are able to go to extremely expensive universities, and people who don't come from well-off families are unable to do that? Why? Why does that even make sense to you? It doesn't make sense, because people should be going to universities based on their potential and their academic ability, not based on their parents' wallets. That doesn't even make sense for society in the future. Where are you going to get surgeons from in the future? Where are you going to get, scientists from in the future if you're not pulling people who have those abilities, regardless of their origin? You're actually sowing the seeds for the destruction of your own society by failing to do that. And there are historical precedents for societies that have done that. So this is something that really frustrates me. I do blame the right in a way, of course. I think that all these fascists and nationalists running about are pretty terrible. But I also find that it's quite amazing how the kind of left elite has sort of abdicated and wandered off to deal with the fringe issues instead of dealing with the main core issues, I believe. In order to give, you have to take. In order to give, you have to take. You can't say that people on the bottom, they think that everyone's going to magically level up somehow. But you can't have people on the bottom are not going to get anywhere unless you take from those on the top, really, frankly, just to be blunt about it. They will have to relinquish some of their power and some of their privilege. You cannot have a situation, people who are born today or born 15 or 20 years ago, how can they afford a house when these houses are costing, millions of dollars and are out of their range, So if you say, well, house prices have to come down, then technically, of course, you're taking from the people who own a very expensive house. But something has to give in order to equalize this situation, right? If you want people to live, if you want to provide social services, they have to be paid for. Well, in order to do that, you have to end tax avoidance, which means, yes, someone doesn't get a yacht somewhere down the line. But that's what's necessary, And I think they've just abdicated dealing with that because, I don't know, because perhaps they're afraid to, or perhaps because they feel it's impossible. I don't know.
Well, people, when it comes to economic inequality, I think that people have this misconception that people earn in the society what they work for, and right. That it's all proportionate. That even that billionaire, that he worked, that much to get that, billions of dollars. Yeah. And people should realize that the top 400 people in America have 80% of this country's wealth. Yeah. So 400 people, just to put that in perspective. Yeah. 400 people, it could fit on a plane. It could fit on a passenger plane. That's it. And that's 80% of our nation's wealth right there on one passenger plane. And then you have the other 320 million people fighting for the other 99, or fighting for the other 20%. There's 99.999% of the population fighting for 20% of the remaining wealth. It is totally, unfair how it's set up. And that's the thing, is that one of the billionaires at the very top. You just have somebody, one guy that's $30 billion. Think about how many homeless people would be off the streets with that $30 billion in their hands. So, of course, it costs a society money for people to be that rich. It costs a society great. Billionaires at that level, and I'll say it straight out, when, there's definitely been, like, one exception I could think of, where it was a guy that gave, like, 98% of his money to charity. But, is that billionaires are generally parasitic to a society. And the more you have in a country, the more problems you can have with economic inequality. It's like, you notice that it doesn't matter what country you look at. It's not like you look at these very poor African countries that billionaires and people, very rich people, don't exist. They still exist. It's just that there's no middle class to be represented. It's so hip that you have like 5 billionaires in the country and everyone else is working for 50 cents an hour. That's how it is in these African countries. In the United States, we have like 400 billionaires, and our middle class is eroding, so practically being not.
Precisely. First world countries are turning into third world countries, basically, right? A few people at the top and a lot of poor people at the bottom. That's basically the process that we're currently undergoing. I don't know if you read, like, Thomas Piketty, The Capital in the 21st Century, but it's very interesting. I mean, if you look, he's analyzing wealth over a long period of time, and he's noticing that for much of human history, that's how it's been, When you have, it's really like a big Monopoly game, and when you have a little bit of money, it's easy, a little bit meaning a lot, like it's easy to acquire more, it's easy to stay rich. And over years, most people tend to stay rich. And this kind of post-World War II society that we've created is actually a very special society. It's actually not the norm of human existence over the last millennia. It's a really good thing. People rarely live under such equality. But in order to maintain that, we have to adapt. We have to make sure we take care of that and treat it as the precious thing that it is. And that doesn't mean running around just being grateful. It means ensuring that the conditions remain right for that kind of society. And I think that for us, that means we have to think about a couple of things. I think we have to think about democratizing society, so not having elections anymore, instead moving to a sortition or lottery-selected and mass participation society, which we have a historical precedent for in Athens. That's how things work there. And I think we need to think about things like social basic income or universal basic income, because I think, things are going to become more and more automated, which is, in fact, a really good thing, right? It's great. Stuff gets produced and you don't have to work. That's terrific. That's like a definition of utopia. And however, we need to think about what is wealth distribution going to be like in that situation. So I think at the moment, the way society is changing, we can head to a dystopia or a utopia, and how we're going to end up really depends on the choices we make. Because at the moment, we're sliding downhill really actually very quickly. And people like to think, oh, well, it's not so bad, this is happening, that's happening, but it is. Pretty much everyone my age makes less money than their parents did, which is crazy when you consider that on the whole we have more education and work harder than they did. So, and it's not just that. When we look forward, we realize that we probably won't get the pensions that our parents are going to get. And we generally have a lot of problems. And then you look at people younger and you notice they're having it even worse, than we did. So we have a major, major, major problem, actually, not a little problem, a really big problem. And it's only invisible because it is actually so encompassing. The very bigness of the problem makes it hard to notice. But it's there, and it needs to be reversed. And if we don't reverse it, we are going to end up living in a third world country kind of relationship. And not only should that not be happening here, we should be getting our act together here and trying to roll that back in other countries as well, right? No one should be living this way. No one in the world should be living this way, where there's just a lot of very, very poor people who have no ability to change their lives, really no life at all, really, when you think about it, and a few people lording it over them because apparently they believe that there's something special. And for that, we do need to take control. And yeah, that's right. I guess in a more equal world, you don't have people parking their boats in their boats. You don't have billion-dollar, billions being thrown around here and there. You don't, because people are more equal with one another. So this extravagance does not exist, or at least only exists in, far lesser amounts. I think that's something people find hard to let go of, that they lose their chance at that extravagance, but it's a false chance. Most of these rich people you're talking about today inherited a great deal of money. So that you would actually work your way to the top is ridiculous.
Well, yeah, it's like what with Donald Trump is that people, Donald Trump's claimed a lot that he was pretty much like a self-made man, that he got his wealth by his own. But even admits, I got a small loan of $1 million. I'm like, wait, what? Small loan of $1 million? Just repeat that back to me and try to say that with a straight face.
Right.
And then I hear that he might actually got a lot more than that. That small loan of $1 million probably is actually more from his dad, Fred Trump, who's already extraordinarily rich. Really, his dad was the one that built the empire, and Donald Trump took it to a new extent and kind of popularized the brand. But I would say his dad did majority of the dirty work too, and his dad was known to be a pretty much a scoundrel. Is that he was known to have racist policies in his apartment, and he was not a good man, Fred Trump. And even Woody Guthrie wrote a song about the old man Trump back in the 1950s. So he's already known to be already known not to be a good character. And then Donald Trump pretty much, that's the thing, weird thing about Donald Trump is that actually for many years he was seen as, he was quite respected, I would think. And then recently, with all the comments they started making politically, and then when he made his campaign, his image went right into the gutter compared to where it had been before. It's like, I wonder if Donald Trump had been thinking, like, No, it was a lot simpler when everyone seemed to like me, and I was just this, handsome billionaire. Now I'm the president, and everyone seems to hate me, and don't know what the hell I'm doing up here. He's probably thinking about that. He's like, man, I should just hand it over to Mike Pence at some point. But I think when it comes to the presidency, anyways, of America, it doesn't even. They don't really have much say of what really goes on. I think that it's really people in dark suits that are. It's like Putin made a comment actually about that. He said it's the people with dark suits in Washington that are really making decisions. The president, not so much. It's the think tanks. It's all these, people that are the bankers, all these top CEOs that are influencing the policy of the United States. But the president, he's more of a spokesman than anything. He's a figurehead for the corporation that is the United States.
Yeah, there you go. That's actually, there you go. I mean, there's, of course, a lot of interest in this society, right? A lot of people who you can't cross. I mean, this is how it came to be with elections at the end of the Roman Republic, too. I mean, there are people you just couldn't cross if you wanted to be elected, and that means that their policies go without saying. You're not going to get very far without their blessing. So it limits very much the scope of debate. And I think really what we've lost a lot in the last 30 years, really, since Thatcherism and Reaganism, is our solidarity for each other. I mean, there's not much, among the bottom 90% of us, there's not really that much difference, Our interests are quite similar. I mean, even for a relatively well-off person, it's still in your interest to have good education system, or a good healthcare system, or a good mental health care system. I mean, I don't want, it's not good for me either to have people running around who are in need of mental health issues, and they may become addicted to drugs, or they may turn to crime or whatever. If people have serious mental health issues, it's in my interest for those to be looked after, and for those people to be able to get help and to be productive members of society, right? It's in my interest that my neighbor's children get a good education so that they can pay for my pension someday. Right? I mean, we are all quite interdependent on each other, whether we want to admit it or not. But who we can't afford are, these oligarchs, right? You can't afford to have people siphoning off a great deal of your wealth to buy yachts or whatever. I mean, in fact, I think in the 1960s, I think I have this from a book by Joseph Stiglitz, but in the 1960s, the average CEO made 24 times the amount of the average employee. Now they make 243 times that amount. So, if I think to myself, oh, what if I made 5 times as much as my neighbor? I think, wow, I'd have tons of money. I mean, right? That's a lot. And if you say that to most people, that's exactly what you'll say, right? I mean, even if you had double the money that your neighbor has, you'd be like, wow, I'd be loaded, right? But yet these people make 200 times or 1,000 times. And so, of course, they don't have the same kind of solidarity we have. They don't have the same interests we have. They might as well be living on Jupiter. This is a different life, for the rest of us. Even if you're somewhat well off, even if you feel like you're comfortable, you still worry. There's still things that could happen that could ruin your life. But if you're that rich, of course, it's not going to happen. You think I'm cared for forever, right? It's a total difference than, just being a middle-class person who thinks, okay, I have to plan for my retirement, I can get this or that or the next thing. We have, the bottom 90 or 95% of us have, a lot in common. It really is just a few people at the top who we don't have a lot in common with, and who are, sucking us dry, because, these profits are being siphoned out of the economy into completely useless things, extravagant hotels or whatever, or...
See what they literally make is that these people, these top CEOs often make average salary of around $10,000 an hour, which, when you think about that, you put that into perspective, that when that CEO decides to go take a bathroom break in the middle of his shift somewhere, is that he literally he could make $1,000 just going to take a dump. I mean, it's how many people can say that? And that's the kind of, $1,000 for just 10 minutes of work, or 6 minutes of work, actually, would be if they're making $10,000 an hour, while we have to fight some people 2 weeks, more than 2 weeks, even 3 weeks, to get that kind of pay, a lot of Americans.
And that money is ultimately coming out of...
right there.
Yeah, it's ultimately coming out of your pocket. It's ultimately coming out of your pocket, especially when these people have, offshore tax accounts. I mean, that money is being, either I have to pay it to a company that is, overcharging me for whatever services they're providing in order to be able to pay those kind of salaries, or to look at it another way, when they avoid their taxes, I have to pay those taxes in order to keep this economy going, So one way or another, yeah, they're robbing us, basically. To put it mildly, like, yeah, they're robbing us. It's kind of like the Sheriff of Nottingham, pretty much. So that is the core of our problem, and I just feel like that should be something that is more on the agenda of more people. You are not working with us or in the interests of the community, right? I mean, what's a nation? And in a way, this is why nationalists arise, in a way, right? And I mean, even look at the Nazis. The Nazis were national socialists, right? So they didn't call themselves fascists. They called themselves national socialists. And I mean, maybe old fascism is merely national, it is national socialism when you get down to it. People are rebelling against this idea of the winner takes it all. Or I've somehow gotten myself into a situation where I can just siphon this off. I mean, even behind fascism is the idea that you shouldn't, or behind nationalism is the idea that you shouldn't, because you have like some kind of a duty to the members of your nation, and you're all a group of people who need to look after each other. I mean, that's kind of what it is at bottom, I suppose. And I mean, yes, it manifests itself in extremely negative ways, like extreme obedience and totalitarianism and racism and so forth. But there kind of is that strand in there as well, that's what a nation is. So if you don't have an obligation to work together as a nation, like, what does that mean? Do we organize ourselves in a different way? Are we now an international society? Like, what are my rights? What are my duties? Who pays the taxes? Who makes the decisions on how the taxes are spent? These are things that are very vague now in our societies. And that's why I think that some people choose to be more constructive and become like Bernie supporters or Corbyn supporters. Some people choose to be more destructive and support nationalist movements. But it's a response to the same situation.
I want to change the subject a little bit, because I found this article that's about 10, 15 minutes ago. I found this to be pretty funny. From the Express. So, Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto could bring Venezuela chaos. And then it says, Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto contains alarming echoes of his hero, Hugo Chavez, whose disastrous policies drove Venezuela into the ground, an international trade expert warned yesterday. And then it says, and this is where it really got me, once a Latin American success story. Okay, I don't know when they're talking about prior to 1998, but it was a country with slums and in very bad shape in the 90s, but they're going to act like everything was fine until 1998. Venezuela is now bankrupt with the world's fastest growing inflation rate and severe shortages. Okay, and then it goes on to say how the inflation went to Thai's banknote is just worth 2 pence, I guess, because it says P, so I'm guessing that means pence. Or,
yeah, you're right, yeah.
Okay, so after Chavez's death in 2013, Corbyn paid tribute. Yeah, I saw that tweet he made when he died. I know he met Chavez. Like, there was a picture of him meeting Chavez, but they're pretty much saying, I mean, this is crazy.
Well, look, Pierre Trudeau, who was the Prime Minister of Canada and was the father of the current Prime Minister, was good friends with Castro. I mean, they got on pretty well. He used to visit them all the time. So, this is, yet he wasn't considered a dangerous and crazy person. He was merely considered, a somewhat center-left kind of person. So, it's just like kind of they're trying to, Venezuela's far away, so of course they're counting on the fact that most people don't know a lot about it. And so they'll tell you that everything's terrible there and then say that that's what's going to happen here, right? It's kind of like a guilt by association to something that happens far away, so you can't fact-check it, basically.
Well, there were so many things wrong with that statement, too, is that and I've noticed this, is that they've tried to say that prior to Hugo Chavez in the 1990s under Carlos Andrés Perez and other pro-American leaders, that Venezuela was, some people say was one of the top economies in South America, but that wasn't true. In fact, South America, they had terrible economic woes in the 80s, leading up to 1989, when they had the Carazaco, which was a result. There was a lot of looting, a lot of protesting that was happening in early 1989 because of how unaffordable food it became, and people were struggling just to survive. And pretty much the government cracked down on the protesters, killing, by some estimates, 3,000 of them in just a matter of a few weeks. And it became a turning point in the left-wing movement in the country, because after that point, the government became heavily distrusted and led up, really, to Chavez's election in 1998. But they try to make it seem like that they were better off than the other countries around them. Really, all of South America suffered heavily under the pro-American dictators throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, Operation Condor, and the whole history of that is despicable. I mean, I could go on and on and on about that. People that were involved, CIA assets, people like Klaus Barbie that was heavily involved in Bolivia's turmoils, but and they also say that what caused all the problems right now has nothing to do with economic sabotage, economic warfare by the United States government, internal violence from the opposition. There's a lot of the people in the opposition have been doing violent acts. There was recently there was an attack on a maternity hospital just because it had the name Hugo Chavez on it. It was the Hugo Chavez Maternity Hospital in Caracas. It was attacked by right-wing quotation protesters. At this point, we can just call them what they are, is that they're terrorists. They're using terror in order to try to push a political ideology. But that's, they try to blame it all on the economic policy, this total chaos and these riots and, the food prices going up. And also the supermarket chains have been hoarding food, trying to destabilize the country, a few of the supermarket chains, because they are enemies of the government. They are against the Bolivian government of Venezuela. So of course, they're not going to talk about all that on the Express or any British or American media.
Have you read 1984 by George Orwell?
Believe it or not, I have not read the book in length. I think I've read excerpts of it, but I know very well what it's about.
Okay, well, you really should, because it's a very disturbing but very good book. So, I mean, and a lot of it is just kind of like, it's really about the use of language and propaganda. And yes, I mean, when something is happening, largely people have taken the tack of just claiming the complete opposite, just claiming 100% the opposite. And I think most people find it very hard to believe that someone could do that. I think most people would find it quite hard to lie, to knowingly lie, and to lie on a sustained basis. And that's why I think people find it very hard to believe that other people might do that, right? It's a very kind of hard thing to realize. But that's really what's happening here. I mean, we know that more equality and, a more egalitarian wage structure where people maybe make within 5 times as much as the next person or 10 times as much, and that's about the extent of it. We know that actually is a very stable kind of society. We know that it's a society where people have more social ability, where people tend to rise and fall more based on their own merit and their own effort. So, and we know that a society that's very unequal, where that's kind of run according to neoliberal principles, is a very unstable society. So when you look back at the facts, you notice, yes, that's where the evidence is pointing, and it's not because I agree with it or disagree with it. It's just because that's what tends to happen. So yes, what are they doing? They're just claiming the opposite. So it's just a lie. It's just a something that perhaps someone wants to be true, but isn't backed up with evidence. And in fact, the fact that they say an international trade expert says this, well, I mean, this has kind of come to the point. You might have heard that in the lead up to Brexit, someone said, one of the Leave politicians said, "What they're sick of experts." Well, yes, unfortunately, this is the problem. Experts now say this or they say that, and unfortunately, they don't often back up what they're saying with facts, even when those facts would be available. I mean, there's some things that you have to speculate about. There's some things that are maybe more about philosophy, but there are also things that are, factual things. Like you're pointing out, you're annoyed with this article because it's giving a false picture of Venezuela and a false picture of the stability of Venezuela over the last 20 or 30 years. Yeah, but an expert said something else, right? So there you go. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of experts now belong to think tanks that have particular ideologies. I honestly, to tell you the truth, I think another thing that we haven't even really discussed here yet today is that universities have really gone downhill. They're not very impartial centers anymore. They're very, very, beholden to corporations and to corporate funding, and therefore the ability to do, research that is impartial is inhibited a lot because often the results of that are not favorable. It's not delivering the answers they want to hear. So, yeah, that's kind of all playing into this, right? An expert talks to a newspaper, just kind of says what they want to be the truth, unfortunately. I mean, that's the kind of thing that doesn't have an easy answer. What would those policies lead to? Well, you'd have to probably do quite a lot of number crunching and long-term forecast, and you'd probably have to get 50 economists on board to give you a really detailed picture of what would happen there, right? I mean, that would actually be a research, a proper research.
Yeah, Well,
I mean, it's just 101.
The term expert is so subjective nowadays. It doesn't. They don't. They should say at the beginning. It's like, oh yeah, but we don't mean that this is an unbiased expert. We're just saying this is somebody that is going to act like, well, they do know what they're talking about, but they're going to spin it in the favor of whatever we're trying to push across here on whatever news channel. Every news channel they have the.
Everybody has the things that they're in favor. I mean, I'm in favor of democracy. I'm in favor of people having power over politics. I mean, that's something I think is a good thing onto itself. I think the evidence points to that. It leads to good things, but, that's the side I'm on in life. And, that's fine. But I also, how would I say? I mean, I suppose you try to examine your ideas a lot of the time, and you are open to discussing things with people who disagree with you, right? That's the issue. I mean, at least I would recognize that other people have the right to have another opinion, if they so choose, or have the right to have a different value system, I suppose, which is what it boils down to. But, the problem with the papers you're quoting, or the agenda they're pushing, is that it's an agenda that says, I have the right to tell you what the truth is. I'm not going to engage with people who have a different point of view. I'm not going to attempt, something I would do regularly is to try to attempt to disprove my own theories. And if I think something, I think, okay, but what could disprove that? And I really try very vigorously to disprove what I'm thinking. And I try to look for evidence that contradicts what I'm thinking, because I think that's the way to test your hypothesis, as well as you can. So that's not happening here. And, that's just one article. There's probably hundreds of similar articles we could read, and it works because Venezuela is far away and people don't know very much about it. And, of course, there's a language barrier. So it's very frustrating and annoying, I understand, for people like you who are able to, to follow news in those countries as well, and that you can get a different perspective on it. I understand how frustrating that must be for you.
And what's really frustrating is how the news here is just not even news. A lot of times it's some fluff story, and it's like there was this image that perfectly exemplifies the world media compared to American media. It's like there's MSNBC, Obama declares war on Coke, all who disagree are racist. Fox News is like Obama declares war on Coke, we must support Pepsi now. It's like CNN, Obama declares war on Coke. We'll have a press conference in 15 minutes. BBC, drone strike in Pakistan, kill 6 people. It's like, and then go to some other news source or whatever. It's like, you go to Press TV. United States imperialist bastards kill 6 people in Pakistan. We declare Ayatollah will release a statement in 5 minutes. Not saying that Press TV is not good stories, but of course they come off as kind of biased sometimes with their their bold headlines. It's all around the world. They have their different biases. That's the thing, is that there is no really such thing as an unbiased news source. That's why you have to really read a lot of different ones to try to get a sense.
Yeah, there's no such thing as not having biases, but there is such thing as trying to make things based on facts and reason, and not just saying a bunch of stuff. A bunch of stuff that has no logical basis and is obviously self-contradictory from the get-go. I mean, people can exercise logic, they can exercise reason, they can try to assess if facts build on one another in a logical way. I mean, these are things that are now totally missing, almost, from mainstream media, right? I mean, there's a few exceptions, but by and large, it's like, okay, I just said it because it sounded good. Or my favorite are the people who write articles and say, oh, I had an experience yesterday, I'm going to extrapolate some truth about humanity from that. It's like, it's just one experience, it's anecdotal. I mean, that's not even statistically relevant. Right? Or even studies. A lot of the time now you'll read, oh, a study said this or a study said that. And you look up the study and it turns out the study involved 15 people. I mean, that's not a representative sample. So that's not a study. So you might do a study with 3,000 people or 5,000 people and you might still turn out to be wrong, but at least you used a decent method. I mean, these are things where the method isn't even going to lead to, cannot even lead to a conclusive result. And where people are just, saying things because it sounded good. I mean, this is the point where we go from bias to taking leave of your senses, I think. I mean, have you ever read Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky?
No, actually.
Okay, that you really should read. That is probably the best book ever.
Best book ever?
Yeah, potentially, yes. I would put Manufacturing Consent on, like, my top 10 books of all time.
I'll definitely check it out.
I would definitely recommend that to anyone. It's an extremely good book about, kind of showing how media works and how consistently, it's dealing with a lot of the things you're talking about, But I'd say don't get angry. At this point, I don't even read. I mean, I keep up with the news, but other than that, I don't read much media. And the reason for that is I kind of think, this is a lost cause. We need to be, it's a system that's self-imploding. We need to be working on building a new system. We need to be working on bringing about democracy. We need to be working on altering our economy in a way that people can live like a reasonably dignified life, and that we don't become a society governed by a few oligarchs at the top. So I think, this to keep complaining about this system is like that train has left the station.
Well, talk about the reason I still even pay attention to CNN, MSNBC, or all of them is that how I see it, it's like tuning into the enemy transmissions. Is that you have to see what they are putting out there. The United States government, the elite are telling the people, because that way you can combat it more effectively. Dispel exactly the kind of things that are being claimed. One of the major things that I think needs to be debunked heavily is this Russiagate and all this stuff about the Russia hacking the election. Because this is dangerous. This is a very dangerous precedent. And I'll tell you that I've seen the attitudes of some people regarding this. Is that I've literally seen one person on Facebook saying, "Oh yeah, we used to nuke people for these kind of aggressions or whatever." This is what kind of anger this can bring out in people. I think this is why they're doing it. This is why they know that Trump is heavily unpopular, and if they can blame Russia for his upbringing to the United States presidency, then people will translate that to anger towards Russia, because they're not worried about supporting Trump in the short term. That's a short-term thing, Trump's presidency. But the continued provocation, the continued cornering of Russia and demonizing them at a new McCarthy strategy is a long-term. This is what they want to do I think this is their ultimate goal, really, is to make Russia kneel. And even though that probably won't happen, and it seems that everybody that has tried to take down Russia has always failed, and I don't know why people even keep trying. I mean, you see Napoleon, Hitler, all these different, world leaders and powers that try to take down Russia ultimately fired back heavily at them. But I still think the United States government is trying to take them down in a softer fashion this time.
Well, during the Yeltsin years, there was a lot of control of the Russian economy. I don't think that the way Western civilization has developed is that, overt military action sure still happens a bit so they can minimize the casualties to their side. But of course, economic warfare has certainly replaced a lot of military warfare. So during the Yeltsin years, there was actually quite a lot of control of the Russian economy, and really, you could say complete looting of the Russian economy. So I think that is probably the situation that they would like to return to. I think that is the goal myself, because yes, I mean, this whole Russiagate thing it's an example of what's ridiculous, and it is an example of, but it's kind of like what I'm saying. I mean, instead of looking at facts, it's been a lot of speculation and a lot of self-contradictory accusations, which have spiraled to the point where people, most media repeats this as if it were a fact, when it's just some kind of very, very tenuous and not really water-holding speculation, right? I mean, what happened was a spear phishing email. Like, anyone could have done that. These kind of things where they say only Vladimir Putin could order what? A spear phishing attack that, like, pretty much anyone could do is absolutely and totally ridiculous. And, I mean, even this idea, like, this way that they print in magazines again and again and again that Russia hacked the elections. I mean, that's giving a very false impression of what happened at all, which is that emails were leaked. I mean, that's not hacking an election. I mean, that's a leak. That's emails were leaked. Someone leaked some emails, and they managed to obtain those emails in a super easy way. So that's all we know, right? Someone obtained emails in a super easy way and leaked them. That's not hacking an election. That's two totally different things. So that's why I say, I mean, I really do think that this will not change until we, I think it's so embedded and so many people have an interest in maintaining the system. I mean, obviously there's people who are editors, who have prestigious positions in these magazines. Obviously they have decided that it is in their interest to continue publishing these stories and that makes more sense for them to do so than to do better research. So that's why I think it's important to focus on change, deep change, instead of just, fighting this rearguard action.
I mean, we can only hope. But, yeah, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for
having you on the show again. And always great talking to you. And
yeah.